My name is Kalenda Eaton. I'm a professor of Africana Literature and Black Cultural History in the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to the Fall for the Book 2020. These free online events run from September through November. You can find the full schedule at fallforthebook.org. And be sure to follow us on Crowdcast. You can do that by clicking the Fall for the Book icon above this window and then clicking follow. And for this event, if you have any questions, please include those in the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest authors for today. Keith Clark is professor of English and African American Studies at George Mason. In addition to his new book on Ernest Gaines, he is the author of Black Manhood in James Baldwin, Ernest J. Gaines and August Wilson, and The Radical Fiction of Ann Petrie, which won the College Language Association Creative Scholarship Award in 2014. His essays have appeared in Callaloo, African American Review, Black Queer Studies, a Critical Anthology, and Black Women Playwrights, Visions on the American Stage. Karla Slocum is the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the Institute of African American Research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She specializes in studies of place identities, race, and history in the Caribbean and the United States. Slocum is the author of Free Trade and Freedom, Neoliberalism, Place, and Nation in the Caribbean, published in 2006. Her second book, Black Towns, Black Futures, The Enduring Allure of a Black Place in the American West, was published by UNC Press last November and explores the ongoing significance of Oklahoma's historic Black towns. Slocum is also the co-founder and co-chair of Black Communities, a conference for collaboration, a gathering begun in 2018 to connect scholars and members of Black communities who can partner on projects that support Black communities' capacity to thrive. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I would like to begin with a question about how you both came to write these books, which are brilliant, by the way, and they both seem very kind of personal in a way too. So starting with Keith, can you speak to what inspired you to take on this project?
Sure. Thank you, Kalenda, for that question. So it was funny. You mentioned my previous book before this one was on Ann Petrie, and Ann Petrie is really a major voice who still hasn't received her critical due. And so actually, I had it was a challenge to get that book published, quite frankly. We're all unpublished, so we all know how that road, how treacherous that road can be. And so I have a wall of rejection notices. But Louisiana State University Press eventually published that book, and I was delighted that they did it. And so for my in conceiving my next project, I actually was very interested in perhaps doing a book on Southern Black male writers, which would obviously have included Gaines, but I wanted to move into more contemporary writers beyond Richard Wright. Richard Wright is the patriarch of Black Southern writing. And so I was interested in Gaines, but also some younger writers like Randall Keenan, rest in peace, he just died a couple of weeks ago, Raymond Andrews, Albert Murray, those writers that few people had heard of. And so in the midst of sort of conceiving that project and finishing the Petrie project, my editor at LSU Press, Margaret Lovecraft, asked me if I was interested in writing a book on Ernest Gaines. And given the sort of the challenges and difficulties I had finding a publisher for the Petrie book, before she finished asking the question, I said yes. And so that was how this book came to be. And so I wasn't, planning to write a book specifically focused on Ernest Gaines, but with that, the press solicited this book, and Margaret, made it clear that she thought that I was the person to do it, given that I had written about him quite a bit. And so anyway, that's a little bit of how I came to do this. I could say more, but I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Karla?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the personal part, and I feel like my current book sits at the nexus of both a professional and a personal interest. I'll talk about the professional one first. I have a background studying rural Black communities. You mentioned in my bio at the beginning about studying the Caribbean and the US. So the first major research project that I did in my career was in the Caribbean, looking at rural, largely African descended communities, and really the importance of independence to the people who are in these communities. Usually the plantation in the Caribbean context, English speaking Caribbean context, was looming very large, and a lot of people sought ways to get away from underneath the plantation. And so the communities I ended up studying in the Caribbean, and St. Lucia in particular, really had as part of their identity this investment in being able to become independent by acquiring land, being able to work for yourself. And so I had that sort of as the background. And of course, these are features that you might be surprised to think that there would be a connection between a St. Lucia and the Caribbean and Oklahoma, but actually, when you think about just sort of Black history across the Americas, this really is something that we'll see broadly. And so I had that background doing that research in the Caribbean, and that resonated with this particular project. And just my general interest, as you said, about studying place history, rural conditions for Black people. Personally, I have a background to the communities that I studied in Oklahoma. My grandfather was a sociologist who, for his own dissertation research and post-dissertation research, studied historically Black towns in Oklahoma. My mother and my aunt and other family members, my grandmother consequently spent time in these communities while he was doing his research and also working at one of the historically Black university in Oklahoma, Langston University. So I had that family connection that actually, luckily for me, dovetailed well with my professional interests as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. I was kind of speaking about that and kind of a segue into the next question in terms of kind of places and spaces here. You both write on topics very dear to me, literature and space. But aside from my own personal interests, these are also topics that are extremely important to a fuller understanding and appreciation of the Black experience in America, for example, and of course, in the Western Hemisphere. So, Karla, in your work, you state that there is kind of this pool of a Black space, the chance to be a part of, reconnect with, and perform within Black community. And Keith, in your study, you say, the key to navigating Gaines' fiction is an understanding of Louisiana, identifying the people and places of the state as his creative matrices, etched indelibly in his artistic imagination. And I love both of those quotes. Of course, I pulled them out, but I love both of those quotes. And I'm just wondering, can you both talk to us a bit more about the role of place and geography in your projects? Maybe starting with Karla.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful way to draw a connection between our books. Um, and I have this idea that I talk about in the book called The Black Sense of Place. It's not my idea. I'm pulling it from a geographer who has written extensively about this concept of a Black sense of place. And of course, there is always going to be variation among different groups of Black people and how they connect with place and their communities and different kinds of spaces. But one thing that has been discussed is this idea of the importance of things such as freedom and independence, community, as you mentioned through that quote, the idea of being able to be self-sufficient, the idea of having safety and security when the larger context has a lot of threats to Black life. And so historically, Black communities in historic Black towns in Oklahoma and elsewhere, they have as their founding this search and this pull of for a place, or this pull to a place that can provide those kinds of things: safety, security, self-sufficiency, and community uplift through being part of a larger Black community where everybody is invested in these kinds of things. So definitely there's that part of it historically for Black towns. You know, when you think about Black towns in a contemporary sense, which is what I write more about as an anthropologist, there's been a lot of work historically on Black towns, on the history of Black towns, on their formation, and all those sorts of things that I just described. I focus my book much more on the here and now of Black towns, and there still is that pull of the place, and there still is that Black sense of a place, and the things that I just mentioned are still important to the town's identities for sure. But also, I talk about the fact that there are um, there are qualities such as inclusivity, having a community that is sort of inclusive of a variety of kinds of Black identities and Black people in them. One that also has and elevates a kind of respect for Blackness and an affirmation of Black culture and history. These are the things that I was seeing coming up. So you have Black town festivals. I write in the book about how I attended a lot of rodeos, for example, which are part of Black town life. And these are places where people are really sort of drawn to those kinds of events in part because there's a chance to be part of this larger, important Black gathering, really sort of a sense of Black community where Blackness is normalized, where Blackness is affirmed and valued. And again, sort of thinking about back to what I was talking about historically, it matters in today's world still because there is that larger world where Blackness isn't always affirmed. And so this having that kind of a place where you can have that affirmation and value attached to Black life really does matter. And I found that in Black towns.
Mm.
Thank you. Keith?
So for me, Kalenda, this was kind of an interesting question. So on the one hand, from a personal standpoint, Ernest Gaines and I are both, Southern men. I'm from Virginia, he Louisiana. But, what people, I guess, don't always grasp or fully think about is that the South is not just sort of one big blob. I mean, the South is different states and different places and different experiences. So even though we're both Southern men, I still needed to, being from Virginia, I needed to immerse myself in Louisiana history as much as I could because it's a place that really is kind of foreign to me, right? And that history is very distinct even from most other Southern states, right? With the New Orleans and Creoles and Cajuns and Louisiana being a former French territory. So there's that sort of Louisiana has an interesting kind of almost global kind of history that other southern states might not, like Virginia, might not necessarily have. So personally, I really needed to do a lot of background work in terms of immersing myself in Louisiana history, which meant, reading these big, huge histories of Louisiana. I mean, these were 400 or 500-page books, but I felt like I really needed to do that kind of work if I was going to do justice to the Louisiana that Gaines inscribes, given that place and space are really staples of his art. He said in one of his many quotations about the place, he said that one of his earlier teachers said to him, "You have that sense of place," right? And so just about every Southern writer worth her or his grain of salt is rooted in a sense of place and landscape and that sort of material, tactile connection to the land. So that's no less than Ernest Gaines. You think about Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. You think about Mark Twain. You think about Richard Wright, The Black Belt. You think about Zora Neale Hurston writing about those Florida swamps. So geography, light, landscape are completely connected to the lifescapes of the people in this place. And so once I sort of did my own immersion in education, then I started reading several of Gaines's quotes about place. And there was one that really stuck out to me. So he has an interesting history. When he was 15, he left the rural Louisiana hamlet in which he was born and reared. He grew up on a plantation. And at 15, there was no more, he was born in 33. So at 15, there was no more school for him. Louisiana did not have high schools, or at least in this hamlet, for Black kids. So his mother and his stepfather had moved to Vallejo, California for work. So they sent for 15-year-old Ernest so he could, continue his education. And so he did just about all of his writing in terms of his books in San Francisco. That's where he eventually moved to. But he talked about how even living in San Francisco, Louisiana, and this is a quote from another interview he gave. He said, "Louisiana is the thing that drives me. It's that Louisiana thing that drives me." So in one of his quotes, he said, "I must go back to the plantation where I was reared. I have to touch. I have to be. You melt into those things and you let them melt into you, the trees, the rivers, the bayous, the language, the sounds. Much of this flat rural part of the world is wrapped in a thick green carpet of sugarcane, notched at the edges here and there with tiny camps of cabins and gardens and clotheslines." And so that landscape. So Gaines grew up in a little town called Oscar, Louisiana, which is part of Point Coupee Parish. I get that wrong sometimes. Point Coupee Parish in Louisiana. And so, he grew up living in a two-room cabin, which was a former slave cabin. So this is how he grew up. No running water, no toilet. He was reared by an aunt who was disabled. And so this disabled woman who could barely, get around is the woman who reared him. And so because she couldn't move, the people in the community would come to her cabin and they would talk and they would share stories. So Gaines said that his education, the genesis of his writing, was sitting on that porch listening to the old people talk. And because he had some schooling, he was the only person who could read. And so Gaines talks about listening to those stories, listening to people sit by the ditch banks and listening to their stories and listening to those stories on the porch. And then Gaines said that the old people would ask him to write letters for them. And so that was the genesis of that was like an incubator, I guess, for his artistic life. So it was that cabin, it was that porch, it was the False River, which he grew up on. He said, the False River, we bathed in it, we fished in it, we washed our clothes in it, we were baptized in it. So you can see this tactile, tangible connection with space to gain. So that's just a really important dimension of his work. So you really can't understand his work unless you first understand place and space. Yeah.
I really like the way you both talk about, the kind of place consciousness in both of your projects. And I'm just thinking as you were talking, Keith. So I grew up in Vallejo, California, and all my family, is still there. But the thing that's interesting is that, so my grandparents were from the South, and interestingly enough, my grandmother grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and so, but the homestead, I guess, was in Texas. And so when I was growing up, I was around, a lot of her friends and my grandfather's, friends and what have you. They all were from Louisiana and Texas and what have you. And so that sense of place that you're talking about that Gaines still has with him when he's in, Vallejo, he brings with him and never really lets go of is something that even as someone who, was born and raised in California, I was always surrounded by kind of people who brought the South, with them, right, and brought the Southwest with them. And so when I went to college in Louisiana, everybody thought I was from there because I was like, oh yeah, I know about this, or I know about that, what have you, even though I wasn't. So yeah, I mean, this what place means and how it's kind of kind of etched into your soul, right, and then how that comes out in this writing, I think is just really amazing.
That it's fascinating that you say that. Gaines, so he wrote most of his books from San Francisco. He says 2 small apartments in San Francisco, and he says people always ask him, well, why don't you ever write about San Francisco? And he says, I tried it. He said he wrote stories about it. He said, but they just never rang true. And he said that that getting away from Louisiana actually gave him a greater sense and understanding of it. It was almost as though he had to defamiliarize himself and to sort of get away to write about it. But once he got away, he said it all just started pouring out. It started pouring out. So it's fascinating how that sort of distance and defamiliarization was the thing that really animated his creative genius in terms of writing about it.
I wanted to pick up on something you were also talking about, Keith, which is just sort of the geography of the country, thinking about the South and the West. And it's true that I have framed my book, at least by title, as Black towns in the American West. But of course, Black towns in Oklahoma, there are lots of ways in which you can think about Oklahoma. I mean, people have a really hard time sort of placing Oklahoma. Is it the Southwest? Is it the Midwest? Is it the West? And there's an argument also for Oklahoma being part of the South as well, and not just the Southwest, but the South. And so this idea about people's lives, and I would even argue their families and ancestors' generational lives also are sort of etched into their soul, to use your term, Kalenda. Because one thing that I also cover in this book is how people who came, sort of the origin stories of Black towns are not just with an individual person's, like my story about how I came to a Black town, but it's going to be about my grandfather or my great grandfather's stories that have been passed down over generations. And those stories, in many cases, are connected to the Deep South and people sort of running for their lives. I use that term in the book, sort of running for their lives, the racial terror that their family members experienced historically in the Deep South, and that having a lot to do with the connections that they ended up forming to Oklahoma's Black towns. So you really can't understand the Oklahoma Black town story without understanding the story of the Deep South for Black Americans. And those stories are very much woven within families' stories and just sort of the fabric of the family life that they bring into the Oklahoma space as well.
Yeah, I appreciate those terms, Karla, running for their lives and racial terror. One thing that Ernest Gaines is very clear about is that just because he, writes diligently and rigorously and carefully and even lovingly about rural Louisiana, he's very careful that he does not romanticize that. And so, he writes about, racial terror. He writes about a justice system that is horrifically racist and perverted. He writes about people who feel like they are broken. He has this term in A Gathering of Old Men, the broken Black man. And he talks about himself, as potentially a broken Black man. He says, as much as I love Louisiana, if I hadn't gotten out at 15, I probably would have ended up broken or dead or in an insane asylum or in the notorious Angola penitentiary. And so, Gaines too is certainly sensitive of those same things of that Black people fleeing and trying to find a Black paradise or a Black homeland in Oklahoma and Kansas and in Nebraska and these places. He was also very sensitive to that reality as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. I want to ask a question before I open it up to the audience questions. And also, audience, don't forget, you can submit questions in the chat. So we're here, right? In the year 2020. And for all of the ways people predict what might happen in years with significant numerical dates, I don't think anyone was prepared for what we're experiencing with the, viral pandemic, the, reanimation of global social justice movements, increased visibility of anti-Black racism, a very contentious election year, and the list goes on and on, right? So as you think about your respective subjects, and you were talking a bit about this, Keith, a few minutes ago, thinking about Ernest Gaines, right? And then also, of course, with Black towns in Oklahoma and connecting them to this moment. Where do you land? Where do you guys land? Like, for example, are there ways that you consider the work even more relevant in today's America, or not? I'd really love to hear more about how current you see these topics that you both have written about today. Keith, you want to start?
Oh, sure. So in the appendix of the book, there's an interview I conducted with Ernest Gaines in the summer of, I think, 2014. And as we were wrapping up, we started talking about, of course, invariably, you start talking about politics, and we started talking about Obama. And so I asked Ernest Gaines, what he thought about this term that people had started bandying about, post-racial. Ernest Gaines was real clear. He said, America ain't post-racial, nothing. It was like, no, because we've elected a Black president does not mean that America's ills, America's angst, America's attitudes about race have really appreciably changed. And so, he was very clear that, as much progress as we have made, we ain't close to overcoming. And so if you look at his fiction, you look at a book like A Gathering of Old, A Lesson Before Dying, I'm sorry, was his last full-length novel. He published a short novella a few years ago, but this was his last full-length novel, and it's set in the 1940s. But the book is basically about a judicial system that is the antithesis of justice for African Americans. And so, if we think about that, we think about Black people wrongly convicted for crimes that they did not commit. I mean, this book is about that and how the criminal justice system really is almost like monstrously just gorgeous Black bodies. And so you think about that book set in 1940, he published it in 1993, and we think about that now and, look at this idea of the prison industrial complex. I mean, it's just, so, it's the change and same, as Baraka said, so another thing from that book, A Lesson Before Dying, is the education that those poor Black school children had, from they grew up in going to a church school, grades 1 through 6, and that was the end of their education. And if you think about it in the contemporary context, we think about how poorly resourced too many schools in urban and rural areas are, right? And so, the threadbare education that Ernest Gaines received, unfortunately, too many, children of color are still receiving that inadequate education because resources are just not adequately distributed. So, I could go on and on about the contemporary resonances of his work and how it reverberates in 2020 as much as, the time he wrote it and as much as the time in which he said it.
Absolutely. I think there's the very current moment, and then there's sort of the broader 21st century. Of course, I am focusing on the 21st century in the book, so I feel like it's completely relevant to the broader issues of 21st century, as well as to the very here and now, what we're going through at this current moment. Black towns were founded out of this idea of preserving Black life. Amid all these threats that I've outlined before, the purpose of these communities was to provide safety and affirmation for Black life. And you don't get any clearer idea of that than through the Black Lives Matter movement and all the kinds of organizing that's going on now. So there's direct resonance, of course, with that. I think the other thing I want to say is that so Black towns have this moniker. Their title is Black towns. The demographics vary, but they are by and large predominantly Black demographically. I spent my research asking people if they thought, one, that label still applies, and if they think Black towns should remain Black or should be Black. Actually, I shouldn't say remain, that they should be Black. And it was very interesting, the responses that I received to that. People are absolutely 100% proud of their community's histories and possibilities and working actively for their possibilities. But there also was a very interesting thing that I observed in the research, which is that people have an embrace of the ideals of this country around race. And by that, I mean that they were more than open to, they actually thought there was a social good associated with having a racially diverse Black town. And I understand that or I talk about that in the book, and the way I come to understand that is, just like I said, there is an embrace of America's ideals of racial diversity and equity, right? Equitable diversity, not just diversity, we're all sort of mixed in together, but there is actually social and racial equity. And I saw that time and again from a variety of standpoints in the community. So I think that's also about the here and now, because what are these movements doing right now? They're fighting for racial equity. And I think Black towns are striving for that, and there are lots of different ways in terms of the activities that they organize and the discourses that they elevate that that points to that. The last thing I'll mention, of course, is because we're coming up on an election, a presidential election. Many people know that Oklahoma is politically a red state. And in, I think, the past two presidential elections, Oklahoma has been county-wise, it has been entirely red. If you break those data down, though, those election data down to the precinct level, you're going to see a different picture. So while the pockets are small, if you go to certain levels, precinct levels, you will see that there are some blue precincts in Oklahoma. And where are you going to see those blue precincts? You're going to see them overwhelmingly in Black town areas. So I think one thing I really wanted to sort of get out there is Oklahoma is not as homogenous as you think. There is some diversity politically across the Oklahoma landscape, and you can associate that, I believe, with race, at least partially. And there is sort of this overwhelming redness to the state politically, of course, but don't forget that there are these other kinds of pockets of Oklahoma that paint a different sort of picture. And I just think that's something to kind of keep in mind.
No, wow, that's fascinating, and I want to talk more about it. But I see that all these audience questions that are coming in, so I want to shift a little bit to those. So thank you all for sending the questions in. The first one from the audience: why did Keith select Gaines as a person to write about? So I know you spoke about, of course, what inspired you. But why Gaines?
So, it's interesting. When I was, Ernest Gaines has been one of those writers who's been anthologized probably beginning in the mid 1970s. So he's, found his way in the African American literary canon. But it was only when I got to graduate school that I was introduced to his novels. And the novel that I read, and one of my mentors at University of North Carolina was Dr. J. Lee Green. It was a novel called A Gathering of Old Men. And it really was just, it changed my life in terms of just the depth and complexity with which he portrayed African American men. And I really hadn't ever been introduced to that. And so there was that sort of, I felt like this was somebody who really, even though, I was in my 20s and the protagonists of that book are 70 or 80 years old, but it really hit me in a way. And so from that moment on, I have looked at his fiction as performing an intervention in terms of how people think about African American men in America. And so Gaines really provided a really more panoramic, complex way of thinking about African American masculinity, not just African men as victims and victims as racism and just these miserable lives, but also the ways in which African American men connect with each other, the ways in which they connect with their communities, the ways in which they connect with their families, the ways in which they grapple with issues like sexuality. All of those things were there. So that was what appealed to me about Ernest Gaines, was just this complexifying of Black men's, and specifically Black Southern men's lives.
Okay. The next question is for both of you. What are each of you reading now? What would you recommend besides, of course, your own books, which will be excellent reads? So what are you reading? Karla, do you want to begin?
I'm about to read, one of the things that's high on a list for me is a book by Brandy Summers, who is a geography professor at University of California, Berkeley. And the book is called Black in Place, and it is generally about gentrification in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So that's an interesting question from the audience, Kalenda. So I mentioned, talking about Black male Southern writers, I mentioned Randall Keenan at the outset. Randall Keenan was a wonderful writer who actually was born in New York but grew up in rural North Carolina, so very much experienced like Ernest Gaines, much younger. He's was born in '63. And so Randall Keenan was a professor at the University of North Carolina, and and Karla actually corroborated for me about 3 weeks ago his death. So I learned of the brother who played Black Panther,
Chadwick Boseman.
Chadwick Boseman. I learned of his death Friday night, and then I learned of Randall Keenan's death Saturday morning. This was really devastating. So about a month before Randall died, he published his second book of short stories and his first book of fiction in almost 30 years, called If I Had Two Wings, I believe is the name of it. So that's high on my list. And another book I'm about halfway through is a book, let me get the title right, called Evidence of Being, and it's about Black gay writers and Black gay literary movements in the United States.
All right. Another question. How do you both view your scholarship as forms of activism, if you do so? Uh, Karla, you want to begin?
Um, you know, I one thing I hope for the goal of my book, one goal I have for my book is that it impacts the narrative about how Black peoples connect to their communities and how Black communities are. You know, we have a long history of pejorative understandings of Black communities. The Black communities are places of devastation, criminality, these kinds of things that we're all familiar with. And, you know, social scientists and I think some humanities scholars as well have been contributing to breaking that idea apart. It's largely, though, something that has been addressed in the urban space. So a lot of the scholarship is on sort of urban Black America to break apart those kinds of stereotypes that we have about Black communities. And I'm trying to make that intervention in rurality, in Black rural communities, about Black rural communities. And also, I think awareness, because also the Black rural experience is one that we don't hear much about. Some people are even surprised to think about Black people in rural places and spaces. So in some sense, that's how I think about the activism around my work, is its impact on breaking apart stereotypes and assumptions about Black people and their relationships to communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'll answer the question in a sec, Kalenda, but I just want to pick up just on something that Karla just said about Black people in rural spaces. You know, Ernest Gaines, didn't set foot in the library until he went to Vallejo as a 15, 16-year-old. He had, Louisiana, but he barred from going to the library, Jim Crow. And so he said, that was when he began his reading regimen. And, he loved Faulkner. He said Faulkner was, one of the few writers who dealt seriously with Black people. But he said still in Faulkner and other white writers that Black Southern people, if they appeared at all, and they usually didn't, but if they did, they were stereotyped, they were buffoons, they were clowns, and their lives were just, really just portrayed as just this morass of ignorance. And so Gaines said that part of what drove him as a writer was, I have to write about people, and I have to fill this space. I have to fill this breach. People don't think about rural Black people and their lives in any kind of way other than what Karla was saying, this sort of pejorative or stereotypical way. So Ernest Gaines really saw himself as doing performing a critical intervention. Now, would also say, had also written about that, but she wasn't on syllabi, she wasn't in libraries.
Right.
Now there was Jean was another writer. So, he didn't have those writers as models. So he set out to fill that void. And so, and in terms of this issue of activism, I'm glad you asked that. One of my former students a few weeks ago, when they were having a protest on campus this summer, and he felt a little guilty for not going. He had COVID concerns, and he just, was concerned about it, and I didn't go either. And I wanted to convey to him that, there are different forms of activism. There's that form is certainly important. It's certainly important. But I see my intellectual and scholarly work as a form of activism. My last book on Ann Petrie, she was an author that really to a lot of people, unfortunately, was an obscure writer. Here's this woman, first Black woman to write a novel to sell 1 million copies, and a lot of people have not heard about her. And so I see my work as sort of intellectually trying to show people that there's a rich tradition of African American arts and letters, and that work I think is vitally important. So I think that literature and literary scholarship and Karla anthropological and historical scholarship, these things are very much interventions because there's a gap there. There's the gap there.
Right.
Add something quickly
Mm-hmm.
also. I think since June, well, and maybe even earlier with the show Watchmen, the story of Tulsa and the race riot of 1921 is much more accessible, and now more people are aware of that history. Um, I'm glad that, so there's a lot of work now being done to recognize the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And there's a commission in Tulsa that's doing this work, a body of a group of people, scholars, activists, people in political life as well. And I'm glad that Black Towns has been included in the large body of material that they're distributing and sort of making available to help round out the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so, I mean, thinking about this question about activism for our work, I feel like the work is also contributing to an understanding of the broader context of the Tulsa Race Massacre now that it is on people's minds. And also with a colleague, I created something called hashtag Tulsa Syllabus, and it is something that provides more information about the Tulsa Race Massacre. So,
Okay. We only have a few minutes left. There is another question, so I'm going to try and squeeze it in here and also ask you to for last words. So we'll see if we can make that happen in about 4 minutes. But this last question actually is for you, Karla, and it's asking if you noted any gendered differences in how place was interpreted by interviewees.
that's a great question. Um, Not necessarily how it was interpreted, but I can say about the involvement. And I'm not actually, and when I say I can't answer that about interpreted, I think that what I want to say is that I didn't address that in my work. So there may be some interpretations that vary by gender, but that's not the analysis that I did. But um, in terms of people's connection to and investment in their communities, one thing that's very interesting is Black towns got their start with Black men as leaders in the communities. They were, a lot of them ran the prominent businesses in the communities, but certainly for the town council and the mayor and, things like this, they were always going to be men. And there's sort of an iconic image of Black towns with a bunch of men suited up, standing on steps, representing, and that image really circulates widely. So I think it sort of also drives home this idea of men being prominent in leadership in the communities. You're not going to find that today. Actually, you're going to find a lot of women who are leaders in Black towns today. It's not to say there are no men, but there are many women who are leaders of Black towns, who are the mayors and the town council members of Black towns today. A lot of that has to do with the caregiving roles that Black women assume, because a lot of Black women, there's a lot of outmigration from Black towns. So people migrate back when their elders in their families need care. And so somebody might be retirement age or nearing retirement age, returning to take care of their elder family members, and they get involved in the leadership of the communities when they return. And a lot of times that is women who are in those roles. Women are behind the force of the rodeos, believe it or not, in terms of the organization and the planning and all the financial dimension of Blacktown rodeos, especially in the town of Boley. So women have a much stronger leadership role in Black towns than they did previously.
All right. Keith, I'm going to allow you to close us out here. Any final words that you want to leave with?
I think actually, Kalenda will want to leave with a few thank yous. I'm just, really appreciative of the people who put this together. I know Susie Rigdon would fall for the book. Really, worked really hard to put this together. And I really owe a debt to my good dear friend Karla Slocum, not only for her brilliant work, but we were trying to find somebody to moderate, and she said, "Well, I know this woman who has been using my book, and who's also a literary critic." And I said, "Oh my goodness, that would be perfect." And so that's she introduced me to Dr. Kalenda Eaton. And so I, just
Thank
really
you.
wanted to thank Susie and Karla and you, Kalenda, for your fine work as well, and just encourage people to read about the history of Black people going west. We know about the great south to north migration, and the warmth of the suns, and all of these studies about the Black migration northward. But there's also a very important history of Black people going west, as Ernest Gaines's life represents as well. So I would just get to help encourage people to turn to works like Karla Slocum's work, and scholars who are doing that kind of work.
And yours as well. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all of the members of the audience and all of the organizers. Please be well, take care of yourselves, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Yeah, thank you.